Sydney Sweeney has for genes.
You may have seen this ad, the one with Sydney Sweeney smiling in perfect denim under the caption, "Sydney Sweeney has great genes." Not sure, maybe it's just a pun. But is this the whole message? Just two words, good genes. Two words that on the surface feel harmless. But for a lot of people, why do these two words feel loaded?
If a beautiful blue-eyed white woman has quote-unquote good genes, well then who has bad genes?
Over a century, societies around the world have used the idea of good genes to decide who gets to belong, who gets to have children, whose lives are valued, and whose aren't. Does this remind you of anything? For over a century, ideas about better and worse genes have shaped how society treats people. Genetics feels neutral, objective, scientific. But historically, genetics has been used politically, to rank people, control reproduction, and draw boundaries around who counts as fit. Historically, genetics has been used to decide whose lives matter and whose don't. And today, those ideas show up again. So the real question isn't just why did this ad go viral? It's why do we still react so strongly to the phrase good genes? And what does that say about how we understand the genome today?
To understand why a phrase like good genes feels so loaded today, we need to go back to where these ideas first took shape. Francis Galton. Galton was a Victorian statistician and Charles Darwin's cousin who believed society could be improved by encouraging people with desirable traits to have more children while discouraging everyone else. He called this idea eugenics, literally meaning good birth. Galton believed traits like intelligence, morality, and talent were inherited in the same way as eye color. Knowledge check. If a trait like height or intelligence is 50% heritable, what does that actually mean?
Galton collected family pedigrees, ranked people by fitness, and argued that the state had a responsibility to engineer a superior population. So eugenics became the name for the belief that society should encourage reproduction by people considered fit and discourage or prevent it for people considered unfit.
Eugenics shaped immigration laws, marriage bans, racial hierarchies, and the very definition of normal. We often think of eugenics as something that only targeted race, and race was absolutely central. From Nazi racial hygiene to North American policies that targeted Black and Indigenous women for sterilization. But here's the part most people don't know. Some of the earliest and most aggressive eugenic campaigns weren't about race at all. They targeted disability. Before race, before class, the earliest eugenic campaigns targeted a label called feeblemindedness, which became a catch-all category. It was used for poor children who struggled in school, indigenous people in residential institutions, people with psychiatric conditions, women considered promiscuous, immigrants who didn't speak English, and anyone who didn't fit social norms. Once labeled feeble-minded, you could be locked away. And once locked away, you could be sterilized. This wasn't fringe science. It was mainstream policy, shaped by the ideas that started with Galton, but quickly spread into governments, courts, and everyday life. Most people assume eugenics ended after World War II, but the ideas didn't disappear. They migrated. The language changed from defective to high risk, from unfit to low potential, purity to genetic optimization, but the underlying logic stayed the same. This shows up most clearly through the traits that society still treats as measurable and through the place where eugenics always focused its attention, reproduction. Today, the question is no longer, should certain people be allowed to have kids? It's what kind of kids should people be having?
Reproduction was, and still is, the backbone of eugenics. The defining idea was simple. If you control who has children, you control the future population. When people discuss socially desirable traits, they are referencing traits that you can inherit or pass down to your own children. This leads to the notion of some families being better or fitter. In the early 1900s, this ideology exploded into public life. At state fairs across the US, families competed in better baby and fitter family contests, judged like livestock on hereditary quality. Marriage laws followed. Entire states banned marriages between people considered unfit, disabled people, interracial couples, immigrants, and the poor. During the segregation of the USA, interracial marriages were heavily forbidden and were only legalized in 1967 with the Civil Rights Movement. And sterilization programs, in both the US and in Canada, targeted Black, Indigenous, disabled, poor, and institutionalized people. In Canada, compulsory sterilization affected Indigenous women and people with mental and physical disabilities. In Alberta, under the Sexual Sterilization Act that was created in 1928, nearly 3,000 people were sterilized, with the sole purpose of preventing undesirable personality traits to be transmitted to offspring. Most were Indigenous or disabled. Conversely, some eugenicists focused less on who should not have children and more on who should.
To give birth to children who were seen as perfect in the eyes of the Nazis. Tall, blonde, blue-eyed, creating a master race, the dream of Adolf Hitler.
In Nazi Germany, a push occurred to try to keep desirable traits, like blonde hair and blue eyes, by means of targeted propaganda campaigns that centered on promoting motherhood. The message was brutally clear. Some families were encouraged to grow. Others were prevented from existing. Fast forward to today. Government-run eugenics is no longer legal, but that same pressure shows up through technology, markets, and private choice. IVF clinics now offer embryo selection based on polygenic scores, which are statistical estimates of a future child's risk of disease or traits like height or educational attainment. Companies advertise this as a way to have your best baby, a phrase that frames reproductive decisions and growing your family as equivalent to genetic optimization, or the ability to pick and choose what traits you like. There's a modern movement that brings a lot of these ideas together. It's called pronatalism, the belief that certain groups of people should have more children to save civilization. The most visible examples come from tech-adjacent circles, like Malcolm and Simone Collins, who run a foundation encouraging what they call high-quality reproduction. Their message is that declining fertility among certain groups of people with desirable traits, especially the educated, wealthy, or high-achieving, puts the future at risk, a framing that mirrors early 20th century eugenics almost word for word. Pronatalist influencers talk about genetic decline, selective birth gaps, and civilizational collapse. And because pronatalism merges so neatly with IVF, egg freezing, embryo screening, and polygenic scoring, it offers a high-tech version of that same old idea, that the future should only be shaped by those considered the most fit. Many pronatalists will deny any connection to eugenics, but this still reproduces eugenic logic, just under a sleek and modern facade.
The birth rate is very low in almost every country. And it's something, unless that changes, civilization will disappear.
Elon Musk's fixation with population collapse has pushed pronatalism into the spotlight.
And wealthy tech founders fund research focused on optimizing future generations. The tools look modern. The logic is familiar. Private choice now does what government eugenics once did, dictating what physical and mental traits should exist in society. Private choice still reproduces eugenic logic, even without state coercion. And this choice isn't neutral when society only supports some kind of families and makes the others feel like a burden.
Knowledge check. What connects early 20th century eugenics to modern trends like pronatalism or embryo scoring? Now we're shifting into one of the most important and most overlooked lenses of eugenics, disability. If reproduction was the mechanism, disability was the justification. In the early 20th century, disability wasn't treated as a medical category. It became a social label used to mark people as undesirable. The term feeblemindedness covered a huge range of people: children who struggled in school, women labeled immoral, people with psychiatric conditions, and disabled people living in poverty. Institutions effectively became warehouses, and once someone was inside, they lost almost all control over their reproductive rights. Eugenics boards had the legal authority to decide who was fit to have children and who wasn't. That included approving or denying sterilization. More than 60,000 people, including psychiatric patients, disabled children, and adults living in institutions, were forcibly sterilized this way in North America. One court case cemented this power: Buck versus Bell. In 1927, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the state could forcibly sterilize people it deemed unfit. Carrie Buck, her mother, and her infant daughter were all labeled feeble-minded, based on nothing. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote the infamous line, "3 generations of imbeciles are enough." It became one of the most consequential eugenic rulings in history, and it has never been overturned. Disability was framed as a threat to society, something to be prevented instead of supported. Today the language is different, but the assumptions echo back. Words like severity, burden, and quality of life appear in prenatal testing brochures. Screening is often described as prevention rather than information, and many prospective parents feel subtle pressure to choose the healthiest embryo, as if certain futures are more valuable than others. Technology didn't erase the politics, it just made them quieter. Because embedded in all of this is an old idea, that disability makes a life less worth living. But disability communities and scholars have shown again and again that this assumption is social, not biological. They stress that a life's value is shaped by support, not genetics. And this is why disability is such a crucial lens. It exposes how quickly information can become judgment, how ideas that once justified isolation and sterilization can reappear in new forms through modern reproductive technology.
If disability was the earliest target of eugenics, intelligence became its most enduring one. Did you know? IQ was never designed to rank human worth. The first IQ test created by Alfred Binet was meant to identify children needing extra school support, not to measure fixed intelligence or genetic quality. Binet himself warned against using IQ as a label. But in the early 1900s, IQ wasn't seen as one measure of cognition. It was treated as destiny. People were sorted into rigid categories with names we rightfully reject today, like idiots, morons, and high-grade defectives. Immigrants arriving at Ellis Island were tested with quick, biased questions in languages they didn't speak and labeled inferior stock if they failed. These scores were used to justify immigration restrictions, segregation, institutionalization, and sterilization. Here's the kicker. IQ scores change with education, nutrition, stress, pollution, and social inequality. Clear evidence that intelligence is not a fixed innate property. Still, what made intelligence so powerful for eugenics was the belief that it was heritable, stable, and racially distributed. Scientists like Henry Goddard claimed the entire family carried feeble-minded bloodlines. One widely publicized case, the Kallikak family, argued that low intelligence was hereditary and inevitable. None of this was true, but the idea stuck, that cognitive ability could rank human worth. In 1994, a book called The Bell Curve became a bestseller. It argued that intelligence was mostly genetic, that IQ differences between racial groups were largely inherited, and that social inequality was the natural result of these differences. The book was widely condemned by scientists, not because IQ research is off limits, but because its claims relied on flawed data, biased assumptions, and discredited statistical methods. Yet, its message spread far beyond academia. The bell curve helped mainstream the idea that intelligence is a biological hierarchy, a ladder some groups are born higher on than others. And this is where modern tech picks up the story. That narrative became fuel for today's online race realism communities and for tech funders who want genomic evidence of group differences in IQ. Today, intelligence has reappeared, not through government policies, but through data science, genomics, and tech culture. Companies now claim they can predict a future child's IQ using polygenic scores. Startups advertise cognitive potential for embryos, even though these scores explain only a tiny fraction of real-world variation. The Wall Street Journal reported on what they called the Superbaby Factory, wealthy parents selecting embryos predicted to have higher educational attainment. Meanwhile, a tech-funded network, exposed by Hope Not Hate, has been pouring money into so-called race science, attempting to revive hereditarian claims about intelligence differences between populations. Some funders explicitly express interest in building a higher IQ society. The Human Diversity Foundation, for example, has sought genomic datasets to find group differences in intelligence. And this is where intelligence becomes the modern version of genetic worth, because intelligence is seen as measurable, quantifiable, and optimizable. The language sounds scientific, but the underlying message is the same as it was 100 years ago. Some minds are seen as more valuable than others, and that makes it uniquely vulnerable to eugenic interpretation, especially when paired with fertility tech, polygenic scoring, and billionaire visions of the future. So why do these ideas keep resurfacing? Why does society keep returning to the dream of engineering better people? There are a few patterns. First, biological explanations feel simple. They turn complex problems like poverty, education, inequality into something natural and inevitable. Second, disability and intelligence look measurable. Numbers give an illusion of objectivity, even when they're built on biased data. Third, technology reframes old ideas as innovation. Terms like optimization, risk reduction, and success metrics can hide value judgments. Fourth, inequality creates an appetite for hierarchy. Better children sounds caring even when it reinforces hierarchy. When society is unequal, people look for ways to justify who has more and who deserves less. And finally, these ideas come back because they're comforting to some. They promise control in a world that feels uncertain. Technology reframes old prejudices as innovation. Wealthy funders revive discredited ideas under new branding. But the hierarchy stays the same. Only the language changes. Defective becomes high risk, unfit becomes low potential, poor stock becomes suboptimal genetics. The problem has never been genetics. The problem is the stories people tell with genetics. The genome itself isn't political, but the meaning we attach to it always has been. For more than a century, ideas about disability and intelligence have shaped who society values and who it doesn't. Technology didn't erase these hierarchies. It gave people new language to repackage them and to justify private choice. But recognizing the pattern gives us power, because choice isn't neutral unless support is equal. We can decide that value doesn't come from genetics, that disability is not a defect, that diversity, biological, cognitive, and social, is a strength, not a flaw. The first step in preventing eugenics is seeing it. Once we understand how often these ideas reappear in policy, tech, health, we can choose to challenge them. We can choose a different future. Final knowledge check. What is the core problem with eugenics, historically and today? Which idea reflects an accurate understanding of modern genomics? Why do genetic explanations often become politically attractive?